Hello. A very good evening to one and all. I, Mr. Rudranarayan Das, extend my warm welcome to all the participants joining today's webinar. We have participants joining across the India and abroad as well. The Ranjit Guru Memorial Series of International Webinar is an initiative by the Department of History and Political Science, Jawaharlal Nehru College, Cuttack, in a close collaboration with Center for Adivasi Research and Development, Odisha. So the coronavirus outbreak has disturbed everything, including our physical mode of interaction. But the online platform has helped us to stay connected with brilliant minds across the globe. So the broad theme of our webinar is Initiative Policy Dialogue 2020 COVID-19 live practice uh, beyond pandemic. So the topic of today's session are a culture-centered approach to COVID-19 and the migration of the worker and the pandemics. To enlighten us uh, on the said topics, we have with us the eminent personalities, Professor Mohan Dutta and Professor Annapurna Pandey. Now, I would like to invite Professor Sarat Chandra Pradhan to carry on the session by giving his welcome address. Thank you. Over to you, Professor.
Thank you, sir. Good evening, everyone. I extend my warm welcome to all to this international webinar on Initiative Policy Dialogue 2020, COVID-19 and Life Practice Beyond Pandemic, organized by Department of History and Political Science, Jawaharlal Nehru College, Cuttack, in close collaboration with the Center for Adivasi Research and Development, Odisha. There is a saying, whatever is not in Bharat, it is not found in creation. India is a treasure house of culture and its contribution to entire mankind is more illustrious. Emphasizing India's role in the cultural world, Gandhiji once said, if India fails, Asia dies. India from ancient time presented a bonding social concept through its family, community and society. But the dramatic spread of COVID-19 has disrupted lives, livelihood and community and social responsibility. Recovery from the crisis caused by the ongoing pandemic is talking affected people from different culture. Migrants are adopting various to get rid of such deplorable situation. It is my privilege to welcome erudite scholars to this international platform to contribute and enlighten the assembly. Hence, I take the opportunity to welcome Professor Mohan Dutta, Director, CARE, Massey University, New Zealand. The topic for today's webinar is a culture-centered approach to COVID-19. Friends, the unfolding COVID-19 pandemic is a global issue of 21st century by which nearly every country in the world is affected. In India, most unfold crisis emerged from the COVID-19 pandemic is the migrant workers. Migrant workers mostly comprise of daily wages, laborers, working in the manufacturing and construction industries. They are often denied adequate health care, nutrition, housing, and sanitation. It is found that most migrants in the countries originate from Uttar Pradesh, Bihar, Odisha, Jharkhand, and Chhattisgarh. Due to the lockdown imposed in the country, factories and workplaces were shut down. Millions of the migrants workers are severely affected owing to the loss of the income, food shortages, and uncertainty about their future. Under these circumstances, many of the thousands of them began walking back to home with no means of the transport due to the lockdown. In view of this unpleasant situation, the topic migration of the workers and the pandemic had immense relevance. Let's have a valuable academic exercise through this webinar. I take an opportunity to welcome Professor Annapurna Pandey, Department of Anthropology, University of the California. Have a good time. Thank you all for joining with us.
Thank you, Professor.
Now I would like to request Ms. Payal Agarwal. Ms.
Payal Agarwal.
Yes. Ms. Payal Agarwal.
Thanks a lot. Warm greetings to one and all. With the COVID crisis, the digital mode of education has gained more prominence. Taking the advantage of this, Jawaharlal Nehru College, Cuttack and Center for Adivasi Research and Development, Odisha has able to connect a remote to far away, even foreign countries too. On this very note, I would like to introduce today's guest speakers from the bottom of my heart, who has connected us from across the globe. Our first speaker is the most renowned, widely acclaimed, and a proud son of the great freedom fighter Netaji Subhash Chandra Bose, is Professor Mohan Dutta. He is the Dean's Chair, Professor of Communication and Director of the Center for Culture-Centered Approach to Research and Evaluation, Massey University, New Zealand, which develops culturally centered, community-based projects of social change, advocacy, and activism that articulate health as a human right. Professor Dutta has directed 7 documentaries, run more than 20 advocacy campaigns. His impact on global policy making is evident in his advisory roles with the WHO, that is World Health Organization, UNICEF, that is United Nations Children's Emergency Fund, the UNESCO, that is United Nations Educational, Scientific and Cultural Organization. He has received more than $6 million in funding to work on culture-centered projects of health communication designed to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals. To enrich his academic excellence, he has written and edited 10 books and more than 200 articles and book chapters. His recent publication is Communication, Culture and Social Change, Meaning, Co-option and Resistance with Palgrave Macmillan is a huge success. This year, he has been recognized as an outstanding applied public policy communication researcher of the ICA and outstanding health communication researcher of the NCA. Earlier this year, he was named a fellow of the International Communication Association. His much-cited book titled Communicating Health, A Culture-Centered Approach Communication Division Outstanding Book Award. Recently, he received the 2020 Charles H. Wilbert Research Award and the Golden Anniversary Monograph Award. He has also been selected for Dale E. Brescher Distinguished Mentor Award from NCA's Health Communication Division, Besides all that, I am happy to inform the participants that the director of CARD, Shri Bikram Kesari Jinnah, has got the privilege to study under him at IIT Kharagpur. We heartily welcome you to the platform of knowledge wisdom. Thanks a lot for connecting with us. Sir, your topic as suggested by you is the culture-centered approach to COVID-19 response. Our next distinguished guest speaker is no less than a gemstone for all of us. She is a proud alma mater of where Netaji was a student, the daughter of Odia soil, and she is none other than Professor Annapurna Pandey. She is a faculty member, Department of Anthropology, University of California, Santa Cruz, United States. She has a specialization in cultural anthropology. She is one of the fantastic anthropologists of the global repute. It will be better on my part to call her as a versatile genius, as she is an eminent teacher, an influential speaker, a filmmaker and whatnot. Her documentary Road to Zuni won recognition as Best Documentary Shot at the 2018 Gala Film Festival. She proves herself perfect when she says that teaching is not only about sharing one's own personal research, but also learning from the students and from their experiences as well. Born in the Silver City, Cuttack, Odisha, proud to call herself as an Odia, a student of Department of Sociology, Ravenshaw University in Odisha, though she's staying in a foreign country, but has continuously been a keen supporter of Odia culture, tradition, and a devout believer of the deity of Jagannath. Ma'am, your kind and noble work which you do for the needy people has encouraged all of us. Really, ma'am, it's our honor and your humility that you have accepted our invitation and for sharing your valuable time with us. Ma'am, your topic as suggested by you is migration of the workers and the pandemics. So after this brief introduction of our esteemed guest speaker, I would like to stop here and would like to invite Professor Dutta to share his insightful views. Over to Professor Dutta.
Thank you so much, Payal, for that introduction. I also want to take a moment to thank Rudra for inviting me to this conversation. What I will do is I will take the next 25 minutes or so to talk about some of the key tenets of the culture-centered approach and how I see those play out within the context of the pandemic. And hopefully then we can take it from there in the Q&A session and have more of a conversation. So to set up the framework of the culture-centered approach, I want to begin by establishing the context of the pandemic. Let me ask you first, is this speed okay or do I need to slow down?
Sir, it is okay.
Okay, thank you so much. So, you know, when we look at the pandemic globally and the way in which it has played out, I think there are three things that we need to think about. I will first talk about those three things and then relate those to what the culture-centered approach is, explain the approach, and then talk about how perhaps the approach can be grappled with within the context of pandemic response. A lot of this conversation will draw upon my role with the cultural context of health expert advisory panel at the World Health Organization. And I will discuss some of the ways in which we have been coming up with specific country guidelines with regard to pandemic response. So first of all, when we look at the COVID-19 infections across the globe, one of the things that becomes perhaps the most evident and most visible with these infections is that any epidemic, including the COVID-19 epidemic, is a pandemic of inequalities. That, you know, the deep inequalities that we reside within in societies across the globe, both inequalities within societies as well as inequalities across societies, these have become visible and evident in the midst of COVID-19. So the infections play out along the lines of social class, along the lines of race and ethnicity, along the lines of gender. such that those that are most marginalized in society are also the ones that bear most of the burden with the infection inequality, with the mortality and morbidity rates. You certainly saw that within the context of the COVID infections in India. You see that within the context of COVID infections in the US, where minority communities, African American communities, Latinx communities bear some of the greatest burdens of the disease. Similarly, and along those lines, when you think about the pandemic policy responses, that is, the policy responses that are put into place to grapple with the pandemic, to address the pandemic, also produce the greatest effects on those that are already marginalized. So when you ask the question, where are the greatest job losses across the globe? Where are the places where you see hunger and food insecurity because of lockdown? When you consider what are the spaces where you see the greatest inaccess to testing and healthcare, these are also the most marginalized spaces in society. So there are two things here then. One, that the infections and the infection inequality, which my friend Professor Charles Briggs refers to as outbreak inequality, plays out within the terrains of existing inequalities in society. That's the first point. The second point is that the effects of the pandemic responses also affect the most marginalized to the greatest extent. Now, the second point I want to come to is with respect to the extent to which the pandemic response has been driven by science. So one of the things that we have seen across the globe is that the pandemic, just as the COVID infections, just as most pandemics, brings about a wide array of uncertainties that are tied to the nature of infections. That is, that once an infection emerges and then at one place, and then it starts spreading, and you start witnessing it across multiple spaces, the work of science becomes one of trying to figure out, trying to narrow down, trying to understand the pathway of working of the pandemic, the mechanism through which the pandemic works, as well as the best possible solution. So by nature, you're dealing with uncertainty. Pandemics bring about uncertainties, and these uncertainties are heightened and catalyzed as scientists compete with time in terms of trying to figure out the answers as the pandemic spreads, both in terms of its geographic axis as well as its time frame. So science, in this sense, works with uncertainty, and that becomes visible and emergent within the context of a pandemic. So when you have a pandemic, by nature, it creates a great deal of uncertainty around it, and it also brings about a climate where you have a lot of information gaps, which actually contribute to disinformation or misinformation on what might be called fake news to be disseminated. Of course, this within the context of COVID-19 is exacerbated by the digital media and this social media context where disinformation can spread quickly across communities, and where disinformation, especially by vested interests, can be viralized or made to go viral. So one of the things that you have seen with COVID is the ways in which prejudice and deeply held racisms have been organized and catalyzed in order to build divisions or create divisions in society. Of course, disinformation doesn't just spread by itself. That's the point I want to make with respect to this second argument. Disinformation is actively seeded by political forces, by political parties, and this is done in order to retain their power and control over sort of systems of responses, but also to hide their inefficiency and incompetence in responding to the pandemic. The third aspect that I want to bring up with reference to the pandemic, and this goes back to my first point, is that with any pandemic, when you're responding, it is important to think that the pandemic is produced structurally. That means that it is produced within institutions, organizations, societal norms, and the ways in which these are distributed that are connected to politics and economics. So political economy is vital in the ways in which we think about the pandemic. And therefore, in order to address the pandemic, we need to think about the ways in which we respond to these structural issues, which relates to questions of how do we actually build capacity to respond to the needs of those that are most affected, that are most vulnerable. Multiple public health experts have argued that if you do not address the most marginalized in society and their needs, what you have actually created are open pathways for the pandemic to spread and for this to happen quickly. So it's really important for you to, for policy responses to address the structural context, the inequalities, the poverty, where the pandemic actually tends to play out. You know, in the work that I have done with migrant workers, both in Singapore and in India, one of the things that has been prominent through a lot of my field work is the ways in which migrant workers have been left vulnerable by the policy response. So even in places like Singapore that were initially celebrated as effective models of response to the pandemic, because the needs of the migrant workers were not addressed or thought through, once the infections started appearing in the dormitories housing low-wage migrant workers, where you often had about 15 to 20 migrant workers housed within rooms, the pandemic spread quickly, simply because you did not have the decent infrastructure to house workers. Similarly, when you don't have decent sanitation facilities, when you don't have adequate access to clean water, when you don't have adequate access to masks, these are all structural issues. Then you create the condition that contributes to the spreading of the pandemic. But also along those lines then, in terms of when you look at pandemic response and how much you have equipped communities to respond to the pandemic once the outbreak has hit, what you find is that questions such as questions of nutrition, questions of access to adequate food, questions of access to adequate hospital infrastructures become really critical. Now, one of the things that you have seen across the globe that has happened over the last 3 decades, and certainly so over the last 10 years or so, is the privatization of healthcare. And the global transformation of healthcare driven by neoliberal policies has meant that for many countries, the public health system has been depleted. So what you have is that you don't have enough hospital capacity. You do not have enough community care capacity to actually deal with the pandemic. So just as you're seeing in the case of India, what happens when one is infected? One doesn't actually have access to enough spaces, enough bed spaces to get the decent and the basic quality healthcare that is a necessity. All of this operates within information and communication vacuums. So what that means is that for those that are disenfranchised, those that are marginalized, often simply not knowing where to go to seek healthcare, what to do when one is sick, becomes a critical component of the process of coping and negotiating with the pandemic. So what you really have within the context of the neoliberal transformations globally is sort of a Darwinian model of healthcare, an evolution of the fittest model of healthcare. So those that actually can survive will survive, and those that cannot will not survive. You certainly saw that in specific country responses to the pandemic that went to the argument that, okay, if we don't have enough capacity to care for those above 75, then we will simply let them cope, and those that cannot cope will die off. Now, that is sort of the ultimate argument of neoliberal transformations across the globe, which is that the work of care is individualized, responsibility is individualized, while our collective capacity to care is depleted. So, with that backdrop in place, let me talk about some of the key tenets of the culture-centered approach and how I see that as a framework for pandemic communication. So again, with the culture-centered approach, I want to go over 3 critical points with the culture-centered approach. First is acknowledging that pandemics are sites of deep inequalities. The culture-centered approach argues that structural inequalities and material inequalities in society go hand in hand with communicative inequalities. So what are communicative inequalities? Communicative inequalities are inequalities in the distribution of information and communication resources. So when you consider, for instance, the plight of migrant workers, be it in Singapore or be it in India, the migrant workers that experience the plight of the lockdown or the plight of the pandemic have very little say in the decision-making structures related to the pandemic. So, one of the things that I've constantly heard in my field work in Singapore, for instance, is workers saying, who will hear or who will listen to the voice of the workers? Who is interested in listening to the voice of the worker? Does the voice of the worker ever matter? So this question of not mattering, the voice of the worker not mattering, is tied to the deep precarization of migrant workers within the neoliberal networks of labor movement. So as with sort of, the last 5 decades of neoliberal reforms across the globe, unions and spaces of collectivization of workers have been systematically depleted and dismantled. So that most workers, say for instance, working in sectors such as construction, manufacturing, within the context of Singapore, the key infrastructures do not have access to sites of collectivization and unionizing such that their voices can be heard. So this, in my work, I argue, is a critical component in the context of the pandemic, which is that the plight of the workers today in terms of not having access to fundamental infrastructures of health and well-being is tied to the systematic attack on unions, is tied to the systematic attack on collectivization. It is tied to the depletion of spaces where workers can have a voice. So with the culture-centered approach, then, one of the things that we do in terms of developing interventions in communities is to ask, what does it take to build infrastructures for voice? And how can we create infrastructures for voice at the margins, where it's not us experts that go in to solve the problems for communities, which actually replicates the very inequalities that I'm referring to, but rather how do we build infrastructures at the margins so that the margins can participate in developing solutions, in implementing them, and in creating the basic registers for change. So the way this works then is that, which is my second point, is that effective pandemic response takes place when 2 things happen. When communities at the margins are empowered to have a voice, A, and B, when communities at the margins have fundamental access to the basic structural resources that are necessary. So even in the midst of the failures across India in its pandemic response, you saw, I will talk about 2 examples. you can talk about the Odisha response, and I hope that one of your speakers going forward does that. I will talk about the Kerala response that I have written about. And what you see is that the Kerala model is seen as a successful model of intervening into the pandemic. And why is it a successful model? Precisely because of those two things. One is that it addresses the structural context of the pandemic. So it addresses the needs of those at the margins with the fundamental infrastructures, with the economic infrastructures, with the public health infrastructures, as well as basic elements such as ensuring adequate supply of food through community kitchens, through community gardens, ensuring that migrant workers are taken care of, and ensuring that there are adequate spaces to practice physical distancing. The second element is that through the strong science communication and the public science communication infrastructure of India, the state has ensured that the basic science literacy and science capacity of the publics have been strongly built. So when communities are empowered with science, empowered with access to the basic structures of literacy, they're also empowered to participate in ensuring that they practice behaviors that are grounded in science, that are preventive, and that actually respond to the pandemic. So when the community test infrastructures, the mobile testing infrastructures were set up across Kerala, there was pretty big uptake of those infrastructures because there was community participation and community leadership in implementing those infrastructures. Another example that I want to give is, when we look at the example here in Aotearoa, New Zealand, when you look at the role that has been played by Maori iwis, so the Maori are the indigenous peoples of Aotearoa, New Zealand, and iwi is a tribal structure that is set up by Maoris. So when the pandemic initially started, the Maori iwis across the country set up what they're called iwi-based checkpoints. So now, given the history of Aotearoa, New Zealand, where you see vast health inequalities with disproportionate burdens that are borne by Maori, which is similar to the patterns of outbreak outcomes that are borne by indigenous peoples historically across the globe within the context of pandemic, where entire indigenous communities are wiped out. The iwis took charge to ensure that these community-based checkpoints, where iwi leadership would implement the checkpoints, would check on people that are coming into the iwi, so which is pretty much the iwis or the tribal way of managing movement, right? So if you think about tribes or indigenous communities as sovereign communities with indigenous sovereignty, communities is asserting their sovereignty, or what we call in Kaupapa Maori as Tinoranga Tirotanga, which is the notion of community sovereignty. That becomes the way for communities to implement health decisions. So when you actually, the culture-centered approach argues then that when you equip communities to be the decision makers, when you build the capacity of communities in terms of their access to science and science literacy, they are able to offer cultural leadership in responding to the pandemic, in this case, in responding to COVID-19, and in actually developing effective responses to the pandemic. So, one of the policy documents we just completed for the WHO is called How to Prevent Pandemic Fatigue. So what is pandemic fatigue? Pandemic fatigue is that, with COVID-19, one of the things that we are going to see most in all likelihood is that it is going to come back in waves. So in India, you're still going through the first wave, but here in New Zealand, we are already in a second wave, because our first wave, we had flattened the curve, and then the pandemic came back again. So with COVID, what you're going to see is that you're going to see multiple cycles of or waves of infections. So Within that context then, what's likely to happen is that communities, even when in a country like New Zealand, where we had a very strong response, we pretty much had about 99% compliance across the country with respect to our social distancing measures when we went into the lockdown. In spite of that, what pandemic fatigue argues is that when the pandemic returns in the next wave and in the next wave, communities develop behavioral fatigue. They get tired of practicing the same social distancing measures. They get tired of wearing masks, and that's when the pandemic spikes, or it tends to spike. So how do you prevent pandemic fatigue? That is the work that we are currently doing with WHO in terms of offering guidelines to member countries. And one of the arguments that I make in that work, that is my contribution to that work, argues that the way in which you prevent pandemic fatigue and you address it is by building community resilience, which is the capacity of communities to cope with the pandemic, the capacity of communities to develop solutions on their own, and the capacity of communities to bring in culturally based solutions in relationship to science, so that the behaviors that you're recommending are no more in opposition to community norms, but are actually set in dialogue with community norms, where communities feel that they can have ownership over these solutions. So this is a key element of the culture-centered approach. That is, the process of centering culture is grounded in Tinoranga Tirotanga, that idea of community sovereignty, or communities are sovereign in determining solutions that are based upon culturally meaningful ideas. So I will wrap up by talking about my key points once again, and hopefully these will stay with you. So the first point is that if we want to look at effective pandemic response, we need to think about how we are strengthening community responses to the social structures and to the structures that produce inequalities. So in that sense, we need to think about, particularly within the context of health and healthcare, very specifically socialist responses that looks at redistribution of resources, redistribution of public health resources, as well as anchoring these resources in community norms, ensuring that those at the very margins of societies have access to these fundamental resources. That's the first point. The second point, that we want to build community voice infrastructures where communities have a voice and they have a say in the kinds of solutions that need to be created. Within the context of global flows of capital, one of the things that we must do, and COVID makes this very clear, is that we must fight and we must resist the onslaught of neoliberal reforms on unions, on spaces of collectivization, and actually think about the ways in which workers, particularly workers in precarious jobs, can be collectivized, and that space can be created for workers to have a collective voice, so that we do not actually have the kinds of infrastructures that are unsustainable, because it is unacceptable that sitting in 2020, for instance, in a city like Singapore that projects itself to be a smart nation, that we have such poor housing infrastructures for workers. So, the activist Naomi Klein talks about the pandemic being an opening for social transformation. And I think the transformation that is needed is to push back on the onslaught of neoliberalism over the last 5 decades. And finally, the point that the CCA makes is that how do we build community cultural capacity, the effectiveness and the ability of communities to respond to solutions and to build them, drawing upon their own cultural resources, cultural norms, centering culture and respecting the role of culture in community resilience, in preventing community fatigue, and in coming up with solutions that are meaningful. Thank you so much.
Thanks a lot, Professor Mohan Dutta, for your brief but extremely powerful lecture. You have rightly pointed out that pandemic has uncovered every type of inequalities. Critical questions such as nutrition, healthcare are put forward, and we need to have an effective pandemic response. Now I would like to invite Professor Annapurna Pandey to share his insightful views. So we can have the question and answer session after ma'am's talk. May I request Professor Annapurna Pandey to please unmute her mic and to share his insight. Yes. Okay.
Can you see me now?
Yes, ma'am, we can see you and we can hear you too.
Okay, wonderful. Namaskar and wonderful introduction. And definitely Professor Dutta, which I was very fascinated and to hear your lecture. You really put forward a beautiful background for us to take it up with case studies, because we are anthropologists. So is it okay if I'm requesting Professor Trilokinath Pandey to go first and then I will follow? Is that okay?
Yes, ma'am, it is okay.
Okay.
Yes, ma'am, it is okay.
Yeah, and you are doing a fantastic job, by the way. Okay, go ahead. Because we cannot see ourselves, so we don't know whether you can see us, but I am sure, because I'm not very familiar with this Google, presentation, but I hope you can you see both of us?
Ma'am, we can partially see, sir. Partially.
Oh. Can you see him better?
Yeah, right now, okay.
Okay.
Good afternoon. Namaskar, everybody. I am grateful to Annapurna for giving me this opportunity to share her time. I'm an anthropologist and have been in anthropology for more than 60 years or so. And most of my anthropological knowledge really comes from doing fieldwork among the indigenous people in the American Southwest, Hopi, Zuni, and Navajo. And reading about indigenous people globally, Professor Dutta was talking about Maori and many other people. So I was really quite enamored of what Professor Dutta was saying. And his approach is the right approach from an anthropological point of view. I want to make some general comments and also give you some of my own insights, which at my age, I have the privilege to give to anybody who is willing to hear me. The most important thing about we human beings is that we are all not only creatures of culture, but we are also creators, innovators, change makers. And as a result, I would like to talk about the workings of some of the very important ideas Professor Dutta has introduced in his talk. For me, as a cultural anthropologist, culture used to be our bread and butter. But now the butter has been taken by people like Professor Dutta. So we are just stuck with the bread. So culture, all of us human beings are created by our cultures. Through our own experiences, we also add on to that workings of culture. But culture in singular and culture as plural. So I'm trying to make a dichotomy for analytic purposes between culture and cultures. So there is no human being, there is no human being who can say that culture has nothing to do with me, as for a very long time economists used to say. But now I don't think there is any economist who is going to say that. Because as Professor Dutta was saying, this pandemic has uncovered many things which were really covered in the disguise of this or that by the state as well as other agencies which really work on human beings. So one of the most important things we have to learn is this linking between global and local and the impact of that. So even though this virus started in Wuhan, China, within 6 months or so, or not even 6 months, within 3 months or so, it spread globally. And now more than 200 countries in the world are really affected by it. But the effect of this is differentially, the kind of effect it is having on American society is very different from the kind of effect it has on Indian society, and even in different parts of India, as Professor Dutta was saying, Odisha versus Kerala. One of the things we human beings have to learn that nobody lives globally, we all live locally. But our localities are connected globally. And as a result, if we really want to see, we human beings, because of the globalization and because of the state policies, have become much more mobile than our ancestors were for a very long period of time. I have studied indigenous communities in India as well as in the United States, where I met with people who hardly traveled even 20 miles in their lifetime. They were located in a particular surrounding and they remained there. I will give you one example from the community where I spent 5 years, the Zuni people of New Mexico and Arizona. It's one of the most well-known communities in anthropology. If you read the literature, anthropological literature, you will invariably hear about Zuni. American anthropologists started to go there in 1879. By the time I went there in 1964, there were some 68 anthropologists who had been there before me. So as you can see that almost every year there was an anthropologist from somewhere working in Zuni. And the insights which anthropologists produced about Zuni really had global importance in the works of anthropologists like Moss, Durkheim, Tyler, Boas, Kroeber, and others. So in Zuni, what we say, human right, it is the right of every human being to have a job. So every human being in Zuni community had one or another kind of a job. It was the responsibility, it was the moral responsibility of the society to ensure that everybody has a job. The second thing, education. What kind of education? So when they came under the American control, Spaniards came there in 1539 and they colonized it towards the end of the 16th century, and it remained a colony of Spain until 1821 when Mexico took over, and it remained under Mexican control from 1821 to 1846-47, when part of the Mexican War, this whole area was transferred to United States, and it remained under the United States from 1848 onwards. What is the implication of that colonial impact? What is the impact of that colonization? Spanish colonization, Mexican colonization, American colonization, that as Professor Dutta was saying, that these people have been marginalized, but what is the nature of marginalization? Their culture was devalued, their way of life was devalued, their language was completely obliterated unless and until people wanted to preserve it. So if they wanted to, so their struggle has been that of survival. From their point of view, they have as much right to survive as anybody else does. These global forces have not only marginalized, but completely obliterated the culture and worldview of many, many people all over the globe. And globalization has also created a new kind of a hierarchy all over the world. What is really superior and what is really inferior, as colonialism did. The culture of colonialism was that colonizer was always superior to the colonized, and that means that the colonized started to emulate the culture of the colonizer, and terrible consequences for that. In the context of the Native Americans, I wrote a piece, India Man Among the American Indians, in which the point I wanted to make was that when I went to Hopi, Zuni and Navajo, they said that, Pandey, you are an Indian. We are not an Indian. We are Hopi, we are Zuni, we are Navajo, we are Iroquois. Imagine the impact, the psychological impact of that on people. Imagine the psychological impact of that on people. So when Professor Dutta was talking about the relation between culture and structure, state and globalization, one of the very important things we have to take into consideration is what psychological impact marginalization has on the well-being of the people. So what pandemic has really done, that it has not only affected the rich and the poor, but it has really uncovered the different kinds of inequalities which societies exhibit. And it is the job of us researchers to document it from multiple cultural perspectives, from Maori perspective, from Zuni perspective, from Navajo perspective, and so on and so forth. So this will give us a different kind of insight between the linkage we have, global and local. The other thing I wanted to say is the science and society and state. So Professor Dutta rightfully points out that one line of cleavage between the civilized societies, as they were called in 18th century, 19th century, and non-civilized societies, as anthropologists call them, barbarians and savages whom they were studying, was that their societies had science. The indigenous societies they were studying did not have any science. Claude Lévi-Strauss, the famous French anthropologist, taught us that that was a very stupid way of looking at it. They had scientific knowledge about nature. They had scientific knowledge, what he called science of the concrete, science of their day-to-day experiences where they were really located. They had perfect knowledge of ecology. They had perfect knowledge of surroundings. We live in California, and in California there were Native American communities who knew every tree, every spring, every mountain, and they had a kin relation with them. They were treated as part of their larger family. Kin, they were addressed by kin terms, and once you are calling somebody father, mother, uncle, aunt, and all that, your attitude to that is going to be very different. That neoliberal economy, and even before that, the state-operated economy broke up. Because of that, it broke down. And as a result, you can see the terrible consequences of fire and water, fire and flood and other things we are really facing here. To a large extent, it is really an working of, implication of the linkage between nature and culture. There is no nature without culture, and it is the culture which teaches us what constitutes nature and how we are really going to treat that forces of nature. So the project of industrialization created new kind of economies, but it really destroyed the kind of economies which existed before that. And also because of all these things, when we have become too global, almost 30 million people from India are in our condition, diasporic condition. Mentally, we live in India, even though in my case, more than 50 years I have lived abroad. But mentally, we live in India. So what I'm really saying, that this very important point which Professor Dutta brought to our attention is extremely critical, and it has to be looked empirically. What is the work, what is the impact of it on local societies spread all over the globe, and then we will compile some of those insights in order to understand what is happening. The point I want to make is that what state did with the advent of state some 200 years ago, 250 years ago, that is what the Western scholars say. Indian scholars will say that what is this rubbish? We had state for a very long period of time, and I support that point of view. There was a state in Gupta period, there was a state even before that in Ashoka's period, and so on and so forth. So I'm not really going to get into that debate, but the point is that once the state really emerged in Western world, and then it traveled with colonialism to other parts of the world, it more or less monopolized whatever was happening in the domain of culture as well as in the domain of nature. And the workings of the state was different in different parts of the world because of the local situations. In the context of India, before our independence, we hardly controlled any part of what was going to happen to us in India. It was really decided by somebody else and was imposed on us. And the implication of that kind of imposition. So once the state started to wither away because of the forces of globalization, that started to happen differently. Now, I don't want to take too much of my time. Annapurna is patiently waiting. I really want to say something about the United States. So we were in India until the last week of December, and then when we come to the United States, and right away from January we started to hear that this virus is brought from China. Here it is called China virus, and one by one we started to hear that, oh yeah, this is just like influenza. It will have some impact, but it will magically disappear. And that statement was made by the American president when he was in India, when he was speaking in India. Unfortunately, it has not disappeared. More than 7 million people in the United States are afflicted by it. Some 204,000 people have died by now. Almost every day, 1,000 people are dying here. Who are these people who are dying? The people whose health has been affected by inequality. The people whose health has been affected by the workings of inequality. A majority of the people who have died are from that category. And it is the responsibility of the state and the society to ensure that that does not happen. But it happens because state is not in their hands. State is in the hands of the state makers. In the context of the United States, people who have money, who have contributed to the two parties, Republican Party and Democratic Party, and as a result, they have a larger say in what happens in their society than the marginalized people do. If you take the analogy of society as a human body, as it has been taken for a very long period of time, when one part of our body suffers, the entire body suffers. When one part of our body suffers, the entire body suffers. After this pandemic, if we are thinking of reconstructing, transforming our societies, we have to think about it, that every part of the body is integral to the well-being of the body. Similarly, every constituent element of the society and the larger unit nation is equally important. And the responsibility of the state is to ensure that everybody gets his or her share of whatever the state is really producing, not only the people who are sitting at the top here as well as elsewhere. When I came into this world, now I'm in my 80s, there was not a single billionaire in the world. Now I know at least a dozen billionaires sitting here in California. And some of the people I knew have become multi-billionaires. Where does this money come from? Whose money it is? How this money has been produced? And how this money has not been really equally distributed? Everybody has contributed to the making of the nation. Everybody has contributed to the making of the society. And everybody has to have his or her share. So the kind of society we are thinking of in the post-pandemic context has to have this as part of their consciousness. When we in India pray, Sarve Sukhina Bhavantu, who constitutes that survey? Not only billionaires, not only millionaires, not only human beings, but every form of life. This interconnectedness of things and beings have been uncovered by the pandemic. It is the virus which is uncovering the kind of coverings which society has created over a period of time in order to hide and play the games which our politicians are playing. So to a large extent, I'm really blaming the policies which are pursued here as well as elsewhere, which have implications for what is happening to the human beings, irrespective of where they are located. My prayer is that someone somewhere listens to the kind of injustices which have created the kind of inequalities we have. And in the post-pandemic context, we really take that into consideration when we are really trying to reconstruct our societies and our states and our nations. Thank you, everybody.
Come here. Sorry, we're just changing position. I would love to see everyone. I can see, but I do not see myself. Maybe there is something. Okay, is the camera on? Yeah, you all can see? Thank you.
Yes, ma'am, we can see.
Yeah. Thank you, Payal. Thank you, everybody. Thank you, especially Bikram, for including us in this panel discussion. And it was wonderful to hear Professor Dutta. Beautiful introduction, Payal. Definitely one thing I take very seriously. I am a very, very proud daughter of Odisha. And I am an Odia. Proudly identify myself as an Odia. And I work in Odisha. I do research among the migrant laborers in Odisha, especially the women, young women who have traveled from the rural and tribal belt of Odisha to the faraway cities like Bangalore and Tirupur, among other places, as commercial showing technicians and SMO. I'm very interested in learning about how they are affected by the pandemic, because unfortunately I would have by now I would have been Professor Pandey and I would have been Odisha. For the last 4 or 5 years, I have been spending 4 to 5 months in Odisha, just doing research and traveling, giving lectures, because this is the way we want to reward ourselves. I'm not saying what we are doing for the community. I'm definitely doing something valuable for myself. Just spending time through my teaching and research, I promote advocacy. So that's my most meaningful way of sharing what I have gained from Odisha. But I would love to follow up with these young women now who have returned back to Odisha. What is happening to them? So maybe some of the young scholars, if you are interested to work with me, please write to me, and then we can do a core group and we can do some serious research on these migrant laborers. And Professor Dutta was mentioning about Kerala. Yes, the health minister of Kerala has played a very important role. I have been following, and the community approach, and then especially kind of making sure that how they are included and taking serious kind of making serious effort and serious action there. But I am very interested in what's happening in Odisha. So coming back to, and I know that they have come back to Odisha, there have been kind of free food available, but is that what just now Professor Pandey was talking about, this kind of the connection between the kind of the culture and the structure, what Professor Dutta was referring to, is that what this kind of this whole welfare mechanism, that is that enough? Because we see that in India unemployment is very high, and even though the official figure may not be kind of giving us the picture of the reality, on the ground we know that it is really severe. It is scary, because one of the questions I see that isn't it the government kind of role to make sure that kind of to provide employment. So, and what kind of employment we are thinking about, that talk about self-dependency, talk about kind of self-sustenance, but just by throwing in or by just offering rice and dal for 5 rupees, that are we really sustaining our community? So, and sustaining especially the people that who would love to work, who are kind of extremely bright, and who would like to have also kind of equal share of the resources available. So I have been just kind of sorry about kind of since we have had 2 wonderful speakers, I have been researching in Odisha on the migrant laborers. Now I'm doing a project on the weavers of Odisha, even working with some of the young people in the villages of Maniabandh, Nuapatana, and supervising, promoting workshops in these rural villages, that these young people, they don't become menial laborers. They do not, and how they can follow their own family, their own community trade, and how they can also be proud of themselves as very kind of smart, not only producers, also marketeers of their own product. So I'm working on that. I kind of I feel that even though I am not there, I'm very much involved. Now coming back to the thing that I want to present here today, that we heard about kind of the broader picture, and I have been working on a very specific issue that I want to speak about. I'm an anthropologist. I'm working on the Indian immigrants to the United States. And especially because, as you all know, the Indian immigrants in the United States constitute about 4 million, and they are known as the model minority. So what do I mean by my model minority? They are the most successful minority, and the elite minority, very most educated, professional group of people. But and that's the reputation. That's the reputation, that they are the model, and they are the most compared to other immigrants. But here, in the last year, I have developed a project that among these immigrants, there are people who are also very marginalized, who are also kind of who have suffered a great deal, and now more so during the pandemic, they are the ones who have been affected mostly, and I have been writing about them. If anybody is interested, please follow. This is I just put it here. I'm writing for a web journal, americankahani.com. So you can check out my pieces that I'm writing on these H1B, H4 visa workers, and also their children, who are known as the lesser children of the God, because I'm talking about them, that they So let me give you the little background that Indian immigrants in recent times, the technology boom of the 1990s and the Immigration Act of 1990 introduced a distinctive category of non-immigrant H-1B and dependent H-4 visas. By the way, in India and everywhere, that kind of to marry your daughter off to a foreign, to kind of to a techie, I call them techies, or to an engineer working in the United States is considered a status symbol. They make a lot of money, of course, but they come here. They have come since the 1990s as the non-immigrant visa, that is called H-1B visa, and their wives or their spouses who come with them, they are on dependent visa. And dependency is literal in the sense that dependency is literal because these women, sorry that I'm keep on saying women, this H-1B visa holders, they are about now about 350,000 or more in the United States, and their spouses are called H-4 visa holders. Their children are also H-4 visa holders. So these women, because H-1B visa holders, a majority are men, because of the circumstances, not because of qualification. And their wives who come here on dependent visa, they are highly educated professional women. But they come on a dependent visa. Right away, in order to enter this country, they give up their right to work. They are not allowed to work in this country, and they don't have a social security number, which is their ID in this country. Means just like an Aadhaar card. So, and they don't have a driver's license unless they go through their husbands, just to kind of, they don't have a driver's license. And for higher education, they cannot apply for a loan because they don't have anything in their name. So they are not even eligible to apply for any loan or any grant or any scholarship. So being highly educated professional women, they come to this country, they become straightforward, they become dependents. And there have been some studies on it, but by the way, why I said model minority, there are about 4.5 million of Indian origin. The per capita family income is over 93,000. And this new group are distinctly identified by education and occupation, advanced degrees in computers, engineering, related technology, and perhaps any other international migrant stream at any other time. So they constitute about 10% of the American labor force in fields such as computer science, engineering, electrical engineering, and technology. So three things that I want to refer to here. Number one, this H-1B visa holders who come to this country, all of them, many of them, 90%, 99% of them, they have the aspiration to settle in this country. Yes, because kind of, always we say, why do people migrate? I will ask the first question to you all, that think about why people migrate, because we are talking about migrants, and here these people are the kind of non-immigrants, migrants, because they are defined as non-immigrants. They try to be immigrants to settle in this country, of course, to have a better living, right, for a better future for their children, to have kind of always very crudely we say for our stomach, that we have kind of come all the way everywhere. People have trapped, people have spread out. So but in order to become an immigrant, to kind of to get it's called a green card, or called a kind of permanent citizen of this country, that they have to work on a quota system, and the quota system works like this. Even India sends the maximum, India sends the maximum number of H-1B visa workers to United States. You can guess why. The mushrooming of engineering schools and colleges in India, and the kind of, because, and then India is very good, that all the brain drain, that all these kind of, talented people, they come here, they are hired by companies, American companies working in India. So these people, but interestingly, that there is USA sets a limit capping H-1B visas around only 65,000 a year to give green card. 65,000, and 65,000 is divided among all the countries that might coming to the United States. So that means only 7% of the people who come on H-1B visa, they are entitled to get a green card. So in that kind of ratio, what happens, India's number compared to the H-1B, the kind of permanent residency, the eligibility for permanent residency is very small. So somebody coming from Nepal becomes a permanent resident in 2 years. Whereas from India, if somebody now comes on, like, let's say somebody came in 2010 and applied for a green card, that person is still waiting, and he has to wait, maybe he or she has to wait for 50, 60 years. So they become permanent because they keep changing from company to company to have maintain their migration status, or their kind of, their visa their visa status, and they kind of continue. So they are called the migrant laborers. I'm using the word, they are the migrant laborers. Why they are the migrant laborers? Because they cannot get the permanent residency. This is the H-1B, and they have to have a job in order to stay in this country, and not just a job. Not just working in Safeway, not working in a grocery store, or not working, not getting the kind of, unemployment benefit. By the way, they are not allowed to get unemployment benefit. So they kind of, they have to, and job that is defined by the United States as necessary, that United States does not have its own people to fill those jobs. So they have to have the highly specialized jobs in order to continue in this country. So this is their precarious situation. I have already written on them, but I'm going to talk about the women, their wives, that who come here as migrant, as dependents. So what is happening, that in the 7% quota, they have suffered a great deal. So what's happening to these women? These women now, because since they cannot work, in 2015, President Obama declared a kind of a wonderful policy that some of these women could work only if their spouses are in the process of getting the green card. So it's just only a certain group of people, not all of them. So the visas here shape family structures and familial relationship for high-tech workers by reinforcing a patriarchal family form with the man as the breadwinner and the woman as the homemaker. The private sector labor market benefits at the cost of the well-being of these migrant families. I'm emphasizing this. That means this patriarchy is reinforced here, that man is the bread earner and woman is the homemaker. Even with highly educated professional status of these women, they become identityless. There have been many, many cases. So this visa, H4 visa, is called depression visa. It's called a kind of, it's a kind of a trap. The visa, depression visa, prisoner visa, so on and so forth. So now what is happening, that during the pandemic, that as you must have heard, that already there has been a ban on getting more workers from India. So this was introduced in June by by one of the executive orders by President Trump. And with the pandemic, what has happened, that many of these people on H-1B, they have lost their jobs, because they are the first ones to lose their jobs because of the kind of, unemployment rate in the United States became 15. And now it is about kind of, hovering. It says it's less, 10 to 12%. But among the people of color, it's 15%. As we are talking about inequality, that kind of, who loses the job, who suffers during the pandemic. There is a kind of, class inequality here. So, and with the kind of, when the H-1B workers lost their jobs, because many of the service industries, travel, tourism, hotel, kind of, hospitality, and defense, that kind of airlines, all these companies that they kind of, and the retail stores, they have kind of, closed down. They have shrunk, they have closed down their stores, and then as a result, what has happened are closed down their businesses. These H-1B people have lost their jobs. You all must have heard about Vande Bharat, that kind of, this Air India service that, the Indian government introduced. Thousands and thousands of these people have to go back. But interestingly, that they could go back, and then of course, kind of, if they had children who were born in this country, they were not allowed to go back. So again, creating a kind of a separation. So that's kind of, one thing I mentioned, that how H-1B people have suffered during the pandemic, and how the H-4, their wives or their spouses have suffered, that if H-1B people lose their jobs, if the H-4 visa workers, if they were working, called on EAD, or the kind of, that having the employment opportunity to work, this was the thanks to President Obama's order in 2015. So they automatically lose their jobs. So this is again creating this kind of prisoner visa, having a little bit of hope, they have lost their jobs. Third thing I want to mention, that during the pandemic, what is happening, that the USCIS, or United States Immigration Service, has introduced a new policy called the biometric policy. And this biometric policy is to have a kind of, new stamp, a new kind of, a photograph of every worker to kind of, just to renew their visa. And what has happened during the pandemic, that all these biometric centers who were issuing this kind of, that verifying the signature and also the photograph, the ID, they closed down. As a result, the H-4 visa workers who had to renew their visa, they could not renew their visa, and mostly they're women. Think about it. So, and these women, even whatever little kind of opportunity they had, I am part of about half a dozen WhatsApp groups. Just kind of, every day I'm hearing horror stories. People are waiting for 10 months. They are kind of, their visa is not renewed. As a result, they are expandable. They have lost their jobs. So this is kind of, one thing that kind of I wanted to emphasize. And since United States and the embassy has been closed down in India, and what's happening, that children, that's the third thing, that kind of, their children are also, they're known as the aging out children. The children come here as dependents, they are very legal, but at the age 21, they become foreigners. They kind of, they are no more attached to their parents. They are kind of, so they become foreigners. Imagine living here for 20 years. They do not know any other country as their motherland, as their fatherland. And they simply cannot relate to India because they hardly live there. Right? Just to kind of, think about, for they're very, very American, but right away they are just kind of, thrown out. They're called foreigners. They have to deport themselves that as foreigners. They're called the aging out children. And now since the embassy closed down, they have to go back to India. They have to get a stamp. As they become Indians, they have to come to this country as F1 visa or student visa, or kind of, if they don't get a student visa, they're deported. So this is again becoming worse. This is kind of, I'm just touching upon this issue. I know that I have taken too much time. So this is another. And the last thing I want to emphasize, that which for all of us have to think about, Professor Dutta gave a broader picture, a general picture. I'm an anthropologist, so I just want to tell you what's happening in the grassroots. That the last problem that which I have been working on, also called domestic violence. The issue of domestic violence and domestic abuse. What is happening, that kind of this reinforcement patriarchy, these women, that when they are, because of the loopholes or the kind of imposition of the US law, making them as dependents, that their spouses are taking advantage of this. And in many, many cases, many of these women are abandoned, that they are not even recognized as the spouses, abandoned, and their children are used as very much pawns in order to exploit these women. There are many, many cases. I have been again doing my research on it. And also there are cases that these women, they have to endure abuse, even in the foreign soil, without any family support and without having any law to support them. Violence Against Women Act in the United States is is a fantastic law introduced by Vice President Biden in 1990 and came into law in 1994 during President Clinton's time. And so what is happening that, but this does not even apply to these women because of their immigration status. So in so many ways, these women are suffering. So maybe I should leave you with a kind of a little bit of kind of silver lining that what is happening, what's the community effort? Let's not give up hope on kind of how we can address this issue. That I see that these women and the children and that kind of the now adult children, we have that they're forming different WhatsApp groups, different activist groups, taking it to the congressmen, to the Senate, to the kind of to the both houses, constantly writing, demonstrating, and making their voice felt. I, as an academic, what I have taken it upon myself that I write and I publish in this popular fronts, popular, so that way people will read that I am kind of I am an advocate. So frankly, I'm promoting there has to be a collaboration between the academics and the activists and the sufferers. Because because unfortunately I see, especially in India, that I see three different streams. They are going parallel. There is no way, even here too, because India is copying United States in every way, and especially on all the wrong fronts. So my emphasis, my humble appeal is that we need to kind of work with the suffering, the kind of the marginalized. I think we have a moral responsibility to not only to kind of give a voice to the people who are suffering, to support and to become their advocates. Unless we do that, this kind of suffering continues, and then what happens that we just do lip service. Kind of, that's my humble appeal to you all. And now coming back to the community mechanism, just kind of a couple of things I will say, and I will finish that. We were just now, Professor Pandey was saying, now many of us, these indigenous communities, are going back to their own cultural mechanism to support themselves, to respond to the pandemic. I think it's high time we look around us and go back to our indigenous people and see, and also to our community, what we can learn from them. Three things I was just reading about that kind of, in Canada, the indigenous communities in Canada, they're doing three things. Knowing that their situation is very, very vulnerable. The death rate is much higher among the indigenous people. Not that they are weak. It is because of the way just the infrastructure has been developed. And they kind of, they don't get good food, they don't have jobs, they don't have kind of a chronic condition. Again, because of the kind of, the way the state has created this sort of binary, that how they have been othered. And so we see the death rate very high among the people of color, among the indigenous people in the North America. So three things I want to emphasize what they are doing. Number one, they are kind of collaborating. So collaboration. What Professor Dutta was saying, what Professor Pandey was saying, that we really need to take it upon ourselves to collaborate, to kind of bring ideas and kind of how we can strengthen ourselves from learning, from kind of bringing each other's voice and applying it, implementing it on the ground. Collaborate. People are coming back. People that of this kind of the Canadian Indian community, people those who have lived outside, they're coming back to their community to see what they can do for the community. Number one. And second, isolation, because to follow, if we are not, because if we make it a political ideology, we need to see how we can really follow the a scientific rule in order to protect ourselves, our community. So like, the mask, the kind of, that kind of, the whole, the procedure of kind of, how we can isolate ourselves in order to keep ourselves kind of, making our life, and realizing our life is precious. And third thing I would emphasize, that kind of, innovation, that we need to think about how innovative we can be, that under the circumstances, just by eating 5 rupee rice is not kind of, called innovative for me. That we really, the people, the migrants who have come back from these cities, that under what circumstances they came, and they have learned their trade, and they have gone to work, they have supported their families, now they are back. We really need to think about, in a creative way, innovative way, how we can think of new jobs, entrepreneurship, new jobs for them, for us, rather than being kind of, maintaining this sort of kind of, binary, that, oh, it's me versus them. If I'm fine, why should I worry? So hopefully that kind of, I wanted to share some of my findings, and I would love to take questions, and I would also put my email. So thank you again for giving us, Professor Pandey and I, the opportunity to speak to you all. It is just like feeling like as if I am in your midst, and it makes, that's the reason why we woke up at 4:30 a.m. in the morning, and here now, because your 5:30 p.m. is our 5 a.m. in the morning in California. So we were so excited, we wanted to be part of you, we wanted to be in your midst. Thank you again for this opportunity.
In fact, it's our pleasure, ma'am. I want to thank ma'am, you and sir both. My heartfelt thanks to both of you, who has spoken from the core of his heart. And sir has spoken truly that colonialism and now globalization has actually brought disastrous consequences. Really, there is no nature without culture. It is very true that when one part of body suffers, the whole body suffers. And thanks a lot, ma'am, to you too again for sharing a beautiful insights on the visa of United States of America. Really, we need a community support for the marginalized sections of the society. It is true that, no doubt actually, pandemic has taught a lot, but the question always remains that what we have learned from it. So to initiate the question and answer session, I would like to invite Mr. Shubham Das.
Thank you, ma'am. Hello, thank you, ma'am. So there are 3 and 4 questions for Professor Mohan. The first question is from Anirudh Jena. His question is in reference to culture-centered approach and the primary argument of how state, structure, and agency work in a cultural space that is otherwise neglected and sidelined. Considering the current pandemic at a time when there is a acute sense of voice poverty in indigenous and marginalized communities, how do we can use culture-centered approach to develop a more critical understanding of the prevailing situation?
Thank you so much. Before I respond to that question, Anirudh, hi,
Sir,
good to see you.
Yourself, sir, please.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Before I respond to your question, Anirudh, hi, good to see you again. I just wanted to thank Professor Trilokinath Pandey and Annapurna Pandey for that beautiful lecture. You contextualized a lot of sort of the big picture issues I was talking about, and so lovely to hear, how you bring culture to the forefront by sort of these empirical conversation. I also wanted to quickly thank Bikram, whom I didn't have a chance to thank for inviting me to this, and also wanted to offer my solidarity to my friend Samarendra Das, who is a point of contact for my work with a lot of you, and that connection with Odisha in that sense. So I want to respond to that question, Anirudh, by talking about a few things. The first is, if you want to look at the relationship between the state, the role of community, and the role of culture at the very margins, and what's happening, the first thing I want to say is that marginalized communities are already developing responses. They don't need to wait for us as experts to create that space for them. You know, this is a key argument of the culture-centered approach, that, you know, we need to right away, in many ways, the role of the technocratic experts. You know, it's kind of ironic. Sometimes I think, you know, in my role at the WHO, what I say often is that you don't need people like us sitting as experts around policy tables developing solutions, because communities often have the solutions built upon their cultural lives, their cultural values, and as Professor Pandey talked about it, their cultural ways of responding, and they have done so historically. But also, as Professor Pandey said, there is a long history of colonial violence that has worked by devaluing indigenous cultures and indigenous science as a way for addressing challenges such as pandemics. So that often what we have is the pseudoscience that portrays indigenous peoples as savages, so that experts can come in and dictate top-down solutions, often devoid of community voice. Now, I will take the example of where I am and where I do some of my work in Aotearoa, New Zealand. So in New Zealand, for instance, we have a treaty. Just like, you know, across the globe, if you look at the US, for instance, most indigenous communities have treaties. The treaties with the crown or different aspects of imperial powers that define the relationship of a sovereign indigenous community with the imperial power. So in Aotearoa, New Zealand, Maori have the Treaty of Waitangi, or Te Tiriti o Waitangi, which creates the ground for the relationship of Maori with the crown. Now, the good part about Aotearoa, New Zealand is that the treaty is a formal and a legally accepted document, which is why, you know, in New Zealand, we talk about the bicultural model. So in addition to the colonial framework of governance, there is an existing treaty-based form of governance. So you can actually take that treaty and pursue a legal case against the crown for its racism and colonial violence. Now that mechanism, I think, is really powerful because it retains the sovereignty, the Tinoranga Tirotanga of Maori iwi to develop their solutions. Maori can actually sue the state or the crown for not consulting Maori in its COVID-19 response. In fact, you know, one of the things that the New Zealand Maori Council has done, and again, you know, New Zealand with Jacinda Ardern and Labour here has been a great example of good science-based response. And even then, you know, this is an argument I made in a recently published piece, that even then you see the failures of the New Zealand government in terms of its inability to consult with Maori as dictated by Te Tiriti o Waitangi. But in that instance, the Maori Council, which is the elected body of the Maori, can take the crown and the government as representative of the crown to court for not consulting Maori and for Maori to not have voice. Now, what do we do then within that context when we look at Aniruddha global struggles? I think that now is a good time for us to really think about how can we organize in communities at the margins so that communities can have the sovereignty. And I think that is really important, and this is something I argue in my work, is that we need to think about strategies of resistance on the ground, the ways in which resistance can actually work to maintain the sovereign space, but also to rework our state. And I think Professor Pandey highlighted this point, which is that the states no longer represent the interests of the people, but they represent, as the saying goes, popularized by the anarchist anthropologist David Graeber, the state is owned by the 1%, right? So how do we reorganize the state so that it represents us, the people, and it represents the interests of those communities at the margins? So I think there is real need for activism on the ground that reworks these spaces. So with that thought in mind, I think that, and this is where I completely agree with Dr. Annapurna Pandey, that we really need to think about what is the role of the academic. For too long, those of us that do post-colonial, decolonial scholarship, unfortunately, we reproduce the same epistemological working of the colonizer, which is we extract from communities, we take data, and then we publish them without putting our bodies on the line. In fact, on my blog today, I wrote an article called Working Through From Within the Skin. And what did I mean by working through within the skin is how do we put our skin on the line? How do we put our skin in the midst of the struggles of people that we study? I think that to the extent that we reproduce that colonial epistemology of a community being studied by the expert who then comes and goes, we reproduce the same extractive process. So I think, for me, for instance, in my own work, one of the ethics I try to bring into place is that I don't usually publish or write about a particular context where care is working unless the community that we are working in feels that change has been created or solutions have been built in the way it envisions these solutions, which actually then, also change the model of academic publishing and academic work, because it makes us accountable to the communities and the people that we work with. But I think we have to sort of recalibrate ourselves. And what Professor Annapurna Pandey was saying about the relationship between activists, communities, and academics, they have to be brought together and dialogic spaces have to be created. At CARE, we have a program called the Activist in Residence program, where we bring in activists in residence to work with a team on creating solutions. But also the work that we produce then is not in the form of journal articles, but it is in the form of podcasts, in the form of blogs, in the form of videos that then sort of have a different audience compared to the academic audience. It is actually the communities and the activists that we are working with. That's our audience. So that also means that we have to build different communicative registers for voice. And we have to really rethink what is the nature of the academic work that we are doing. I just want to wrap up, Aniruddha, then by saying that, I started by saying that in many instances, communities are already doing the work. So the way in culture-centered approach I see my work or CARE's work as is that how do we stand in solidarity with communities placing our bodies on the line. As those of you that have read my recent book, you will know I talk in the book about the various challenges that I faced and that CARE faced when working in Singapore. So when we were doing the work with migrant workers, placing our bodies on the line alongside the struggles of the migrant workers meant that Singapore has an authoritarian state. That meant that putting our bodies in confrontation with that state to the point where the state created various strategies to come after the center and to shut us down, right? But I talk about that moment as a powerful moment in terms of teaching us that we know that our work is making an impact, because that's when an authoritarian state is coming in and saying you can no longer do this work because it is making some registers of change. So in that sense, I think that putting one's body on the line is also about placing oneself alongside those struggles, because when communities are voicing on, or when those at the margins are voicing their struggles, the state, when it has been organized to serve the 1%, is not going to stay quiet. It is actually going to come and try to silence that, or it's going to try to come and take away that platform. So I think it's really important to strategically think about what does our work look like when building and mobilizing and connecting in that politics of resistance. Thank you.
Another one question from Dr. Vikram Jana. What is the future of the globe beyond pandemic? For immediate relief, which policy will be most wanted?
Thank you, Vikram, for that question. And that's a real big question. And I'm, too limited to answer that question. I will perhaps talk about what the pandemic makes visible. And I think both Professor Trilokinath Pandey and Professor Annapurna Pandey also highlighted this. That is that the pandemic makes visible the deep inequalities that of the world, and the kinds of inequalities that have been produced by really 5 decades. If you think about the 1970s with the Chilean experiment where neoliberalism was first introduced, of neoliberal reforms. And what that has meant is that it has actually reworked most of the globe on the logics of the free market, with basic community infrastructures actually having been dismantled. Along the same lines then, what has happened is an ideology of individualism, individual self-fulfillment, individual gratification has been put forth as the universal ideology of humanity. Now, if one thing we learn in the midst of pandemic, when we look at indigenous responses, when we look at, for instance, Maori responses here in Aotearoa, is that there are alternative values to how we can relate to each other as human beings. So, and we need to learn from indigenous cultures about these alternative values and ways of relating. In Kaupapa Maori, we talk about a concept of manakitanga. Manakitanga means the idea of caring for each other, or whanangatanga, which is the idea of family taking the center of our lived realities. So what does that mean? So for instance, when we went into a lockdown, we have had multiple instances in sort of low-income households that experience poverty, Maori and Pacifica families that have, these are small houses that are built for 2 people, or maybe like 3 people, or 2 adults and 2 children. But in those households, community members have often taken in their extended family of 12, 13, 14 members, because that is whanangatanga, the idea of caring for each other. So that principle, that cultural value teaches us an alternative way of organizing. I gave a talk on this. I think that, one of the things that we need to challenge globally is the ideology of whiteness. I write about whiteness, which is sort of the taking as normative of white cultural values. So one example of whiteness is the idea of family, and the desirable family being the nuclear family, such that the care for aging, the care for aging members of our families has been privatized. It has become a private business where it is privatized out to aging facilities, or, in America, they find a nice way of saying this, aging communities or aging homes. In Singapore, they do the same thing now. They call aging in place and the smart city. And of course, you see this across urban spaces in India, where aging has been shipped out to private corporations, taken out of the context of the family, where the elders in our families had vital roles to play in the life and livelihood of the family. where they had vital roles to play as teachers, as sources of wisdom. So part of the thing, going back, Vikram, to the idea of what the pandemic teaches us, is that we need to challenge the whiteness and the ideology of whiteness that has foregrounded particular kinds of individualistic responses as universal responses, and consider, for instance, what is the role of community, what is the role of love, what is the role of mutual care and affection. I will give you another example to highlight this. If you think about, Dr. Annapurna Pandey talked about gender and patriarchy. If you think about one of the ways in which patriarchy plays out within the context of neoliberal reforms is making care work expendable and devaluing care work, right? So that, what you call the essential workers, the ones sort of at the bottom end of the care economy, those that do the aging care, those that do the nursing care, have minimal protections. So you see this in terms of essential workers in the care sectors not having access to private protective, to personal protective equipment, to the protective gear. You saw these images in the US, right, where you saw nurses, they were literally putting on those garbage bags in order to protect themselves from the pandemic. You saw this in India, where in communities you had doctors or care workers that were expelled from the communities because people were too scared what was going to happen with the pandemic. So that means that we have to reorganize how we relate to care and the work of care. We have to recenter the work of care. In Bengal, in rural Bengal, where I do my work in Jhargram, I had a very sad story. A family friend who is a gynecologist who was working through the entire period of the pandemic, 31 years old, a doctor, he passed away with COVID. Now, once he passed away, his family went from pillar to post for 2 months trying to get a medical certificate, a death certificate for him. That's an example of a care infrastructure that has been fundamentally destroyed by the kinds of neoliberal reforms we have seen across the globe. So, Bikram, I think part of it is that how do we reorganize how we relate to each other, how we relate to our communities, how do we relate to the work that we do, and how do we recenter and revalue care work. These are the key challenges. And, when I speak at WHO in this expert panel, this is something I hope that comes out in terms of country guidelines, is that actually guiding countries to start rewinding some of the extreme neoliberal reforms that have been pushed out and actually find some semblance of creating public health infrastructures. Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
Can I have a question? Shubham Das, please.
Okay. Go ahead.
Can I go for question?
Yes. Go ahead, please.
Thank you, Professor Dutta. One of my queries is that during pandemic period, 7 to 8 lakhs people came from Ganjam district. That migrant workers came from Surat to Ganjam district. They could not get their proper treatment only because they are migrant workers, and they were living in a poor health condition. They came to Ganjam and spread COVID-19. Government of Odisha could not offer them jobs, and they return again. My query is neither the government nor community help them. So what is your response, sir?
What I just talked about in response to Bikram's question about the fundamental laws of fabrics of care and communities of care, we see this at the granular level in communities, that because of the stigma and because of the fear, often migrant workers, when they have returned to communities, have not have access to fundamental infrastructures of health and care. So, and that is a real, so, and you see, you know, this is really such a poignant and heartbreaking scenario, because, you know, what you saw with the COVID infections and the, you know, the 4 hours within which India went into lockdown. And I have done, you know, my team has done 60 interviews of workers that went from Bengal to various parts of India during that time. And that story is also very similar. What happened in those 4 hours of lockdown was that workers were expelled onto the streets, literally. So you have, when you think about it, you know, you see this real dystopian image of these large skyscraper buildings. And in that backdrop on the highways, you find the workers walking away. This really is the status of our cities, where workers who have built these infrastructures of the cities are so expendable that when it came to the lockdown, they were pushed out and expelled out of the spaces where they live into the roads. In the process, as you all know well, many workers died while traveling. Workers died on the railway tracks. Workers died in the trains. And then when they reached back into the communities, they found that in some instances they were sent back again. In other instances, in the communities, there was no infrastructure present. So what that demonstrates to you is that we have two levels of crisis. One is a structural crisis, that it is a fundamental crisis of structural inequality, where we do not have fundamental structures of care for the poor and those at the margins, those whose labor actually builds the infrastructure of digital India, smart India, make in India, and all of that. That's the first point. But second point, and I think this is a more important point, is that I think that since the 1990s, the kind of neoliberal reforms that have happened in India, that has also, I worry, reorganized the moral and ethical fabric of the country. Particularly for a large majority of sort of the upwardly mobile, upwardly aspiring social classes of the country, where the notion of care has been substituted by self-aggrandizement and self-fulfillment and self-realization, so sort of the classic neoliberal values. So I think that we have to fundamentally think about how do we push back against neoliberalism, you know, and this is something I say as an academic, you know, that we often, I find, write about neoliberalism, but do very little in terms of reorganizing our own lives and our own ethics, you know. So what would it mean for me to reorganize my own life so that it is driven by care and the value of care? So the same way, if we think about it at a very micro level, how do we change and restructure our communities so that care is centered? And from that, of course, you can move to all the level of the state, the local response, the state government response, the national government response, and the global response. So from the very micro to the meso to the macro, we need to reorganize and restructure those registers of affect and feelings, putting care at the center.
Thank you, sir. Thank you. Sir, can I have a question, Madam Annapurna Pandey?
Sure, please.
Thanks, Madam Pandey. That it reminds me that you had been to my institution, that is BB Autonomous Mahavidyalaya Chandikhol, where I was chairing the session, and you are talking about feminism. I was coordinator of that meeting. If I am wrong, that Sujata Madam of Sociology Department. So we have a nice interaction there. I am very pleasant to see you again in video. That I have a query, that in your city and my silver city, Cuttack, you will find that slums are residing in two sides of the river. They are not properly health protected. They are the epicenter of COVID-19 because they are working in different household workers and different shops. So my question is, government is trying to make health a home quarantine. to these people? Because you see, one home, one room, which is very unconditional to stay. So how they will remain as a home quarantine? Because they need to go every day, because they have to meet their necessities, because they are not like us who will purchase things for 15 days. So what is your response in this context, madam?
Yeah. Thank you so much. Yes, I do vividly remember meeting you and also having a kind of, this wonderful discussion on feminism and especially women in India. This is Professor Dutta, among others, that I just want to emphasize that Professor Pandey and I, whenever we are in India, we travel from one end to the other. We travel to all these, and this is our anthropological knowledge. To kind of, we go to these colleges, and even people tell us that from Cuttack and Bhubaneswar, people don't come to these colleges. And that's where we see the real talent, the bright people asking such fantastic questions and eager to learn. And I find that this is the COVID of we academics, that we don't want to we quarantine ourselves to the kind of, the silver chairs, and we don't want to move anywhere, and just kind of, we believe in our preaching. So I'm just critiquing myself as an academic, and we need to get out of our skin, as Professor Dutta was referring, and to kind of, to experience that sort of enthusiasm, brightness, and the curiosity. So that's what makes us learn too. Coming back to your question, that my heart goes out. Frankly, let me tell you that we have been talking about the expandable the population. Professor Dutta mentioned about the caregiving, the caregivers. And again, India is following the American model in the name of neoliberal economy, and that kind of privatization of caregiving. And so wonderful that there's this scholar, Sarah Lamb, who has been studying aging in India and Indian diaspora. She talks about that how conveniently we are outsourcing our own sense of responsibility, that and it is happening in every home now, by the way, that with migration and with kind of urbanization, with more and more the kind of that we talk about the education, economic opportunities, what we are doing, and with especially with kind of second generation, the women, that we take it, we kind of that, and highly kind of valued individualization and this kind of individualism, that what's happening, that the aged, the elderly, that they are treated as the bottom of the pole. So, and then kind of, and they are most devalued in our society today. And I want to bring India here. India is on the forefront now. That because if you just follow the statistics, at least in the United States, there are kind of, the institutions, and there is kind of, the institutional support for the aged, whereas in India, still family is looked upon as the primary caregiver. And there is a law that if the children, that adult children, if they don't take care of their elderly, they kind of, they can be taken to court. But how many of us are taken to court? And how many of us are kind of, face the consequence? Because even in the United States, that even the Violence Against Women Act applies to the elderly. And then the Indian parents who come to take care of the grandchildren, when they are mistreated, and I have talked with many of them, they would never go to the court. They would never go to the police. They will never give, because they love their children so much, they would never expose their own children in the kind of, even at the cost of their own sense of well-being. We do not even acknowledge it, that kind of, to think about. And they suffer the most the kind of the age, something to think about. And you asked a very important question, and I want to relate it to this kind of caregiving. Think about it. You mentioned about slums. Now, the biggest slums that if you go to Bhubaneswar, Saliasai, or you go to kind of in Cuttack, all over, because I have been working also with the transgender community in the College Square, that those of them who live in the slums. By the way, that our the middle class, the upper middle class, has been totally dependent on the service class. That in India, that they are the ones who do the household work, and we call it in the name of caste system, we call it patron-client relationship. We call it a kind of caste interdependence of various castes. But today, if we look at it during the pandemic, what has happened? We all have kind of we treat our maids or the kind of household workers as the kind of the greatest promoter of COVID, because or kind of they are the COVID carriers. So what we have done, we have stopped bringing them home. As a result, as just now you mentioned, in the name of quarantine. So what has happened? And we found a way that not to pay them also, because since they are not working, they are not paid. But they don't have any sort of social security. They don't have any sort of support to go back to kind of to have any means to support themselves. So what happens? So they are the ones who are dying. They are the ones, just now, I think before you talked about Surat, that they say if we don't die of pandemic, we will die of starvation. So that's why they're going back to Surat, or they're going back to Bangalore. So we really need to think about what's our responsibility. What's the responsibility of the state here? Just by giving 5 rupees rice and dal does not solve the problem. Their kids may not have a way to go educate themselves, go to school. They don't have the means. So what is happening? So we are promoting this sort of inequality. We are making the inequality even worse in the process. Professor Pandey wanted to say something to it? Yeah. Maybe you can. Yeah. Sorry, just 1 second. Why don't you come down? So we are just changing position.
Welcome, Mr. Professor Pandey.
Thank you. I just want to make 1 or 2 observations. I want to say that instead of privileging Euro-American way of looking at things, take Professor Dutta and his scholarship as a model. Everybody should be really exposed to it, because he really has wonderful insights from different parts of the world where he has worked, and he has really integrated them beautifully. In a way, because if you look at indigenous societies globally, their economies were based on reciprocity and redistribution. Reciprocity and redistribution. Industrial economy changed that. And as a result, what has really happened now, that here in the United States, we are worried about 1% versus the 99%, or even in 1%, 0.01% and the rest of us. That should not be allowed to happen anywhere. But the people who have the power are setting the rules of the game, and they are really playing the game at the cost of the lives of the rest of the people, with whom they don't feel any sense of connection or any sense of belonging. That has to change. The other thing I want to say is that the place where I am, I'm looking at the world in a different way. We are heading towards a different kind of Cold War. And in that Cold War, India will be sucked into, as it was in the earlier kind of Cold War, which went on between the free world and the and the communist world or the socialist world. And there will be consequences for that. So in a way, this global situation is not really going to disappear. Now in the post-pandemic context, we are talking about deglobalization, but globalization in one way or another is going to stay here. And the states really have to develop a kind of strategy to maintain their own sovereignty, not by building these goddamn walls. The pandemic has really taught us that walls don't protect us. This is simply the illusion. We are interconnected, and that interconnected has to be acknowledged globally and also locally. The other thing is sovereignty of the state is extremely critical, but that sovereignty has to be defined in a different way because of the new context in which we are looking at things. I remember in late 60s, early 70s, when I was in Cambridge and Prince Charles was a student, and England at that point was thinking of becoming the part of the larger European community. And the question was, what will happen to the pound? And Charles said that his mom, that is the Queen, said that sovereignty from the sovereign's point of view is not going to be shared. Sovereignty from the sovereign's point of view is not going to be shared. If I am the sovereign, my photograph has to appear on the bill, and pound has to be retained. And as a result, it was. So what I'm really saying, that even states have to rethink how they are really going to reconstitute themselves and in what way they are really going to relate to the other states. So a new way of looking at the world has to emerge, and India is very well situated in doing that job.
Thank you, sir. Now, I would like to request Ms. Payal, please give the concluding remarks.
Okay, thanks, sir. It was really a wonderful evening for the participants to listen. Three of the fantastic speakers. We have actually really got a lot of food for thought, and it is very necessary that the academic section should understand its true responsibility. Now, as the session which has started is going to end, so now I would like to invite Mr. Shubham Das to give vote of thanks and conclude the session.
Thank you, ma'am. Mr. Shubham Das is absent due to some urgency, so I will provide him the vote of thanks. So good evening again. I am honored and lucky to have the opportunity to give the vote of thanks for the session. First of all, I would like to thank our esteemed guest, Professor Mohan Dutta, for his insightful deliberation on culture-centered approach to COVID-19. I would also like to thank Professor Annapurna Pandey for her thoughtful deliberation on the plight of migrant workers during this pandemic. And I would also like to thank Professor Triloki Narayan Pandey for his insightful views and for sharing with us. I extend my hearty thanks to Dr. Vikram Keshwari Jena, Director of CARD Center for Adivasi Research and Development, Odisha, for his friendly cooperation to organize this webinar. I would like to express my profound gratitude to our principal, Professor Pallab Chakravarti, for his cooperation in organizing this webinar. I would also like to thank convener Professor Sarat Chandra Pradhan, coordinator co-convener Mr. Shubham Das, co-coordinator Ms. Payal Agarwal, Mr. Baidhar Das for their support and guidance to organize this event. I'm happy to express vote of thanks to all the participants, including lecturers, professors, students, civil society members who have made this webinar a grand success by sparing their valuable time with us. Thank you. Meeting is concluded.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Namaste, ma'am and sir.
Namaste everybody.